Post-war disinformation regarding the Third Reich, the NSDAP, and prominent figures within the party can be found abundantly throughout academia and general historical and political discourse today. Often the origins of all fabricated, out-of-context, and exaggerated claims can be traced back to organizations like the OSS, which later became the CIA, KGB, or even the FBI. One can also trace back many of these claims and narratives to deceptive and treacherous figures such as Hermann Rauschning, a former NSDAP member who defected to the United States in 1936 and immediately began aiding a disinformation and agitation campaign against Adolf Hitler, the NSDAP, and the Third Reich. In this video, we will focus on perhaps the most despicable National Socialist political figure of the 20th century, a man by the name of Otto Strasser, a figure so vile in his treachery that his own brother, Gregor Strasser, submitted his name on a political enemy list to Adolf Hitler. The life and history of Otto Strasser is one of absolute scumbaggery, arguably unparalleled by any other traitor to the NSDAP. Without further delay, I present to you a reading of The Divide, Hitler and Strasser. When people think of the obscure idea of Strasserism, they think of it as a more radical left-wing element within the Nazi Party that is usually considered as the socialist political opponent to Hitler by some Nazis, leftists, and yes, even some historians. It's normally explained to have been a more anti-capitalist variant of the ideology, so I've decided to explain what the actual divide between Hitler and Otto Strasser was, for those who say Hitler wasn't a socialist, but Otto was. I'd like to instead correct the record on this topic. Unfortunately for those who believe this, in 1919, Gottfried Feder, the Nazi socialist economist who also wrote the official party program, delivered a lecture that drew Hitler into the Nazi Party. Hitler had an interest in Feder's economic positions, so this obviously should show us an obvious socialist side in Hitler. Gregor Strasser took part in the beer hall putsch with Hitler, and after it failed, he was briefly imprisoned. On his release, he sold his apothecary shop and used the money to devote himself wholly to the Nazi Party. Gregor Strasser moved to North Germany, where he quickly became one of the most important figures in the Sturmabteilung, or the SA. He developed a large following and became a leader of the North Wing of the NSDAP. Gregor was also a committed socialist who believed in undiluted socialist principles. In that same year, Gregor invited Otto to dine with him, Adolf Hitler, and General Ludendorff. Otto Strasser was impressed by Ludendorff, and the two got along well. However, when it came to Hitler, Hitler criticized Otto for taking part in the suppression of the Kapp-Putsch. The two would continue to argue until Ludendorff stepped in and sided with Otto Strasser and Hitler stopped arguing. Then they started to argue again, this time over war, Jews, and socialism. Ludendorff ended up stepping in again. Hitler ended up telling Gregor that, quote, "I'm afraid I'll never get along well with this intellectual brother of yours," end quote. Otto decided to join the NSDAP in 1925, but when he joined the party, it was completely disorganized due to the failure of the beer hall putsch, which caused many of the National Socialist leadership to be arrested and the party to be banned for a brief period of time. The section of the NSDAP that Otto joined was the northern section of the party, which was led by his brother Gregor. Julius Streicher was kicked out of the party because of his so-called vulgar anti-Semitism by Otto. Otto was the main editor and owner of the party's northern magazine called Arbeitsblatt. Otto's magazine advocated for redistribution of land, nationalization, strikes, agrarianism, anti-imperialism, class war, and a form of democratic National Socialism. Otto also began to work with the upcoming figure of the Nazi Party, Joseph Goebbels, who was sympathetic with many of Otto's ideas, and even helped Otto and Gregor write the new Strasser program, which was supposed to replace the original 25 points of the NSDAP, which they saw as vague and outdated. They also wanted to limit the power of the leader. All seemed well at first, but things would start to change. Hitler would start to rebuild the party and bring it back under his control. Unlike before the beer hall putsch, when Hitler advocated for a more socialist platform and violent revolution, Hitler now took a more pragmatic and electoral approach than before, along with trying to win over sections of the nationalist bourgeoisie class to his cause. This caused Hitler to strike down the Strasser program, which angered the Strasser brothers, and even Goebbels was somewhat upset. Hitler claimed it was too mild and lacked a folkish spirit. Hitler also saw the program as a threat to his own power inside the party, as it limited his authority. Gregor Strasser and Otto Strasser opposed Hitler's policy of trying to win the support of the country's major industrialists. His outspoken views caused a deep rift with Hitler and other leaders of the party. In 1926, Gregor joined forces with his brother, Otto Strasser, to establish the Berliner Arbeiterzeitung, a nationalist newspaper that advocated world social revolution. It also supported Lenin and the Bolshevik government in the Soviet Union. Later that year, Gregor Strasser was elected to the Bavarian legislature. His biographer, Louis L. Snyder, has argued that initially Gregor wanted to overtake Hitler. Quote, "In this capacity he proved to be an able organizer, an indefatigable if weak speaker, a shrewd politician, and a lover of action. Using his parliamentary immunity to protect him from libel suits and holding a free railway pass, he turned his energy to seeking the highest post in the National Socialist Party. He would push Hitler aside and replace him. Gregor Strasser regarded himself as a proud intellectual who had far more to offer to the party than Hitler." End quote. On the 14th of February 1926, at the NSDAP annual conference, Gregor Strasser called for the destruction of capitalism in any way possible, including cooperation with the Bolsheviks in the Soviet Union. At the conference, Joseph Goebbels backed Gregor Strasser. Hitler explained this couldn't be a public stance, as it would be extremely unpopular with the German masses, and the majority decided to support what Hitler said. Oftentimes, Goebbels himself would compare the Nazi movement with that of Lenin. He would argue that the Nazi faith had little differences with the communist faith. These comments were published in National Socialism or Bolshevism, the open letter to My Friends on the Left, and the National Socialist Letters of 1925. This quickly stopped because it started an anti-Nazi riot. The media attacked the Nazis as being communists. Hitler had to have it quelled down, proving Hitler right. After all this, Goebbels changed sides. From this point on, Gregor Strasser began to call Goebbels, quote, "the scheming dwarf." Moreover, it's normally characteristic for people to bring up that both Hitler and the Strasser brothers disagreed on the nature of property relations. With these two quotes, we can see why this was the case. Quote, "Do you think I'd be as crazy as to destroy German heavy industry? Those producers worked their way to the top by their own merits, and because of this process of selection, which proves that they are an elite, they have the right to lead." End quote. Quote, "We are socialist enemies, mortal enemies of the present capitalist economic system with its exploitation of the economically weak, with its injustice in wages, with its immoral evaluation of individuals according to wealth and money instead of responsibility and achievement. And we are determined under all circumstances to abolish this system. And with my inclination to practical action, it seems obvious to me that we have put a better, more just, more moral system in its place. One which, as it were, has arms and legs, and better arms and legs than the present one." End quote. However, in the proper context, this is not a real distinction. The only times Hitler denied nationalization for private property was during elections or when he tried to attain funding from the industrialists, which was largely unsuccessful. However, Hitler also said this, quote, "The basic principle of my party's economic program should be made perfectly clear, and that is the principle of authority. The good of the community takes priority over that of the individual, but the state should retain control. Every owner should feel himself to be an agent of the state. It is his duty not to misuse his possession to the detriment of the state or the interests of his fellow countrymen. That is the overriding point. The Third Reich will always retain the right to control property owners. If you say that the bourgeoisie is tearing its hairs over the question of private property, that does not affect me in the least. Does the bourgeoisie expect some consideration from me? Today's bourgeoisie is rotten to the core. It has no ideals anymore. All it wants is to earn money, and so it does me what damage it can. The bourgeois press does me damage too, and would like to co-sign me and my movement to the devil." End quote. Both the Strasser brothers and Hitler himself attacked private property as a privilege. This doesn't mean you have to destroy all industries like Otto wanted. Gregor advocated respect for most private property. He maintained that properties must be both social and subject to the needs of the nation. This was actually a normal position within the Nazi Party. You could even say that Hitler would mostly agree with this stance. One of the more famous Nazi leaders, Robert Ley, is even on record as saying this, quote, "Today the owner can no longer tell us, 'My factory is my private affair.' That was before. That's over now. The people inside of it depend on his factory for their contentment, and these people belong to us. This is no longer a private affair. This is a public matter, and he must think and act accordingly and answer for it." End quote. Hitler's official policies reflected exactly what Robert Ley had said here. Otto Strasser, in The Structure of German Socialism, acclaimed class warfare in the name of the proletariat. Otto took it much further than any leadership in the Nazi Party regarding the subject of class. As early as 1925, Gregor Strasser called for an, quote, "economic revolution involving the nationalization of the economy," end quote, in a speech that he gave to the Reichstag. This went to a boiling point in early 1930 when the trade unions in Saxony declared a general strike. Otto Strasser supported the strikes while Hitler did not. Hitler ended up calling Otto to a private meeting to get him back in line, but this did not work. Hitler ended up accusing Otto of being a Marxist, and Otto accused him of being a capitalist demagogue. Hitler's own views on socialism are evident in this debate he had with Otto Strasser over 2 days in May of 1930 with other party members. Otto argued worker ownership was an essential ingredient to National Socialism, but Hitler did not agree. When Otto Strasser argues for revolutionary socialism, Hitler dismisses the idea, arguing that workers are too simple to ever understand socialism. Instead, Hitler thinks the state should overtake both workers and employers. Thus, Hitler argues, a worker taking charge of a company would only get in the way. Otto Strasser, in dismay, calls this fascism. Hitler continued with this, quote, "A system that rests on anything other than authority downwards and responsibility upwards cannot really make decisions. Fascism offers us a model that we can absolutely replicate. As it is in the case of fascism, the entrepreneurs and the workers of our National Socialist state sit side by side, equal in rights. The state strongly intervenes in the cases of conflict to impose its decision and end economic disputes that put the life of the nation in danger." End quote. Otto Strasser fired back in a fit of rage, quote, "Fascism has not found its way between capital and labor. It hasn't even searched for it. It limits itself to containing social struggles by maintaining the all-powerlessness of capital over labor. Fascism is not the overcoming of capitalism. On the contrary, until now in any case, it has maintained the capitalist system in its power, as you would do yourself." End quote. Hans Röpke, who joined the Nazi Party in 1930 and was a party economist, agreed with Hitler, arguing that corporatism was the essence of National Socialist economics, and another economist, Max Frauendorfer, agreed. Max even said that the Italian model provided the only alternative to Jewish Marxism and capitalism. Even Gregor Strasser sided with Hitler against his own brother on this issue. Otto Strasser loathed what was said, and Erich Koch, who agreed with Otto, yelled, quote, "We are not fascists, we are socialists," end quote. In this debate, Otto also defended modern art as a, quote, "precious and youthful force." Hitler called him a degenerate and an intellectual white Jew, and proceeded to argue that true art is a platonic beauty that was in forms, thus making it infallible, divine, and objective. Gregor, after his famous debate, developed a rift with his own brother Otto. This gives us a more clear picture as to what the actual differences are. Otto Strasser was not a fascist, but a guild socialist. Hitler's main focus with National Socialism was driven by the state like fascism was. Fascist economics was the system of corporatism. Corporatism is a nationalized form of syndicalism and was therefore reliant on the trade union model. The Nazis historically implemented exactly this with their state-integrated trade union, the German Labor Front. This even contributes to the fact that the privatization that was done went to the hands of party members, not just random individuals with no ideological commitments, or, as the Nazi economic recovery argues, was done temporarily to finance rearmament. Meaning, it's private in name only, and is actually a state-backed monopoly. Adam Tooze argued in his book, The Wages of Destruction, that Hitler's form of state socialism is what attracted many to the party and eventually began to win Gregor's loyalty. Quote, "The Nazis, who invoked a corporatist conception of workplace organization as part of their larger plans for the creation of a corporate social order, or ständischer Aufbau, the Nazi leaders of the DAF reformulated their corporatist plans for ständischer Aufbau in relation to the industrial working place during the summer and fall of 1933, in ways that accommodated demands for autonomy and employer prerogative emanating from the ranks of German heavy industry. After 1933, corporatist references to occupational estates and the workers' community, combined with racial concerns about the worker's body, individual performance, and the social and biological reproductive functions of the working class family to shape ideological discourses about work and newly reconfigured factory regimes during the Nazi era. Bioracial corporatist terms and assumptions figured centrally in the writings and policies of Nazi physicians and scientists, industrial sociologists and efficiency experts, and DAF functionaries. They also constituted the core of racialist definitions of work, occupational hierarchies, and social order in the much vaunted performance community, or Leistungsgemeinschaft, of the Third Reich. This was visible, for example, in the rationalized industrial workplaces of the automotive firm Daimler-Benz, at the electrical firm Siemens, and in the plans for the National Socialist model factory of the Volkswagen concern. Most historians of corporatist ideology and Nazism have focused on the corporatisms of small producers, such as German retailers and shop owners, with their calls for guild-like organizations and guarantees of state protection. Indeed, Hitler and several other Nazi leaders including Gottfried Feder, Otto Wilhelm Wagner, Gregor Strasser, and Max Frauendorfer were attracted to dirigist corporatist solutions to class conflict and the volatility of capitalist economies, especially to the neo-romantic theories of the Viennese professor of political economy Ottmar Spahn." End quote. As I said, the brothers both began drifting apart because of this economic distinction. Gregor gradually accepted the party line and declared his loyalty to Hitler. Alfred Rosenberg elaborates further on this in his memoirs. Quote, "Otto Strasser came over to us from the camp of the Social Democrats, after having had close connections with its leaders. I felt that he was less interested in following the party line of the National Socialist German Workers' Party than in propagating certain undigested ideas of his own. When he told me that he considered an entirely new economic structure of paramount importance, I replied that it wasn't sufficient to write a number of articles. What he should do was write a well-rounded, carefully thought-out book to give people a chance to study his ideas. This he did not do. The conflict came in spite of the fact that Hitler did his utmost to hold Strasser. Together with some of his followers, he seceded from the party. His brother Gregor remained. I still remember a discussion I had with Hitler a little later. 'Thank God,' he said, 'that Gregor Strasser has remained true. A great thing for us all.' He was genuinely fond of him, even as Gregor Strasser proved his own brotherly love for Hitler by consoling him when his niece died and the Führer was considering giving up his entire political career." End quote. Otto Strasser placed himself onto an economic framework of guild socialism with influences in Catholic distributionism. Whereas Hitler had an economic foundation of corporatism, and had inspiration from Otto von Bismarck's state socialist economics that was associated with the historical school of economics. In essence, this means that Hitlerism was a top-down state socialism, whereas Otto Strasserism was a more bottom-up democratic socialism. Otto and Hitler also had fundamentally different conceptions of what National Socialism actually means. National Socialism, according to Hitler, must follow the Führerprinzip. Otto Strasser objected to this as a lack of democracy and argued that limitations upon the leader of the party were a necessity. Hitler argued in response to Otto that the leader must have absolute authority for absolute accountability. Hitler's views considered it as the only way to inculcate discipline within society, and it was needed for the national idea to be fulfilled.
Old and young, an entire folk, always ready to play their part. Once a month, all of Germany eats a simple stew, even the Führer and his propaganda ministers. The money saved is given to the needy. After the difficult ups and downs of the Weimar Republic, an entirely new feeling pervades society. The Volksgemeinschaft is the carrot proffered by dictatorship. All appear equal. Old class rules no longer apply. In place of social inequalities is a unified society ready to make sacrifices. All know whom they have to thank for this, their Führer. Propaganda turned Hitler into the great hope. The Führer as redeemer and savior. This topos was already predefined long before Hitler appeared on stage. Hitler's art consisted only in giving credibility to the propaganda that he was the coming Führer. A surrogate monarch, perfectly placed into focus, who tolerates no dissent and impels every individual to fall into line unconditionally.
National Socialism, according to Otto Strasser, was a perfected version of socialism. National in its scope, as opposed to Marxist internationalism, and was conforming to natural aspects of human nature like localism and democracy, with an adherence to worker ownership of the means of production. In Hitler's version of National Socialism, socialism was German and focused on the commonwealth of everyday Germans as a group of people united as one based entirely on their race. The concept of the folk community underlined all of the National Socialist project. Much like the basic idea of fascism, a word that stems from the Italian word for a bundle of rods tied together tightly, National Socialism was intended to tie Germans together under one leader, Hitler, the Führer via the state. The intention was to make race synonymous with the state. Hitler's issue was that the state and race historically in Germany were different concepts, so National Socialism had to blend them both together into a singular concept. Whereas Otto supported them being separate, that way autonomy of Germanic regions could be maintained, thus, in his view, protecting organic cultural identities. In early 1932, Otto Wagner put together a new Wirtschaftsprogramm, but through Feder's protestations, it was never made official, and every copy printed was stamped for internal use only. This was replaced by Gregor Strasser's immediate economic program, which was based on Gregor Strasser's work and bread speech, and is what the party took to the July election. That itself was withdrawn in September, supposedly because Hitler felt it was seen as too radical and might be a barrier to his negotiations to become chancellor. It was replaced by the Aufbauprogramm, which was primarily Feder's work. Gregor then created a party syndicate which advocated for the creation of a national pension system, similar to the Solidarity Fund created by the NSDAP, which had already had good results. This idea was supported by both Robert Ley and Hitler. The Strasser brothers, like many in the party, wished to appeal to the communists, hoping to radicalize them from the Marxist camp, something Hitler actually supported. For those curious to what Hitler thinks, look to page 328 of Mein Kampf. In some cities, the numeric strength of party-switching communists to Nazism was estimated to be quite large. Rudolf Diels, the head of the Gestapo from 1933 to 1934, reported that 70% of new SA recruits had been communists in the city of Berlin. The historian Konrad Haydn was one of the first to document this phenomena in his 1936 book, A Biography, remarking that in the Sturmabteilung, it was a bunch of beefsteaks, meaning brown Nazis on the outside, but red communists on the inside. Hitler approved of Gregor Strasser's new organizational strategy, which helped the Nazis make a great leap from being a marginal fringe party to a mass popular movement with a presence throughout Germany. The NSDAP appealed to the lower classes and their tendencies towards socialism. Gregor helped form good relations with some minor industrialists. Then Gregor announced a new economic development regarding trade. Autarky was to be reduced significantly, although protectionism for agricultural and German products was still defended. Foreign trade was emphasized. To overcome massive unemployment, he proposed that Germany should renounce the gold standard, nationalize the banks, and issue public works. These ideas were strongly supported by Hitler, Wagner, Feder, and Ley. This was, in fact, the official Nazi policy during its economic recovery.
Before Hitler, Germany had been deep in economic depression. Before Hitler, unemployment had stood at 7 million. Before Hitler, Germany was a democracy, but too many parties had split the vote, so governments were weak and unable to solve the crisis. Hitler offered dictatorship, all power in the hands of one man. And Germany was quick to accept Hitler's terms.
Unemployment's absurd. People say we are civilized, and yet millions of people are out of work. What is that? That's sick. No one should be denied the right to work, and neither should anyone who can work be allowed to be lazy.
Work and bread. These are the Führer's blessings.
Putting Germany back to work was Hitler's first and most pressing problem. But because he was all-powerful, he had the clout to carry out large-scale work programs, like building autobahns, motorways to link the nation together. By 1935, unemployment had fallen to just 2 million. By 1939, it was gone.
My landlord, Eric, worked for the German Labor Front. He had business all around Germany, and once I went with him to see what they had achieved. And it was remarkable. We saw labor camps, not for wage earners, but for young people, 18, 19 years old, to teach them the value of work, to get their hands hardened. You saw them marching along with their spades like guns, or singing as they dug ditches, reclaimed land. If you spoke to them, sometimes you felt they resented being there, but not often. There was, I think, a pleasure involved. Eric would say,
You must understand, work shouldn't be just earning a wage and going home. That's drudgery. We believe there's a beauty in labor. You do a job well, and it gives you happiness.
it was like the Nazis were shaking people into feeling good about what they did. You had to work. You had no choice. You were organized. You were there for the state to use, and they would milk you for your labor, no question. But then, at the end of the day, they said, "Now, see what we have achieved." And it was pretty impressive.
The work program was vast and triumphal. Hitler had promised a Germany reborn. He said he was building for a state to last for 1,000 years. He'd rebuild Berlin on a magnificent scale. There'd be an assembly hall in every city, a swimming bath in every village, a house and garden and car for every worker.
There was to be no more industrial conflict. Trade unions were banned, and all workers had to join a Nazi labor front. In the Depression, unemployment had reached 30%. Now industry revived, as Hitler set the target of rearming Germany and giving every German worker a job. The party looked for support in every factory. In town and country.
Ich habe die Energie und die Zähigkeit gehabt von den damaligen 1000 Mann.
Help went to the farmers, many driven bankrupt in the Depression.
14 Millionen zu machen und ich werde aus den 14 Millionen die 20 und die 30 Millionen machen.
And to get their commitment, they were swept into demonstrations bringing party and people together. Harvest Festival was staged as a mass occasion, a mix of new ideas and revived old customs.
Diese Tausende von Menschen, die Sie hier rechts und links
The thousands of people you can see all around were farmers, young people from all over Germany. We travelled in special trains and then marched for hours to get as close to the front as possible. I was right at the front.
Ich bin damals ganz vorne gestanden. Wir haben alle dasselbe empfunden.
We all felt the same happiness and joy.
Das Erntedankfest war ja das Dankeschön.
Harvest Festival was the thank you for us farmers having a future again. Things were looking up.
Aufwärts mit uns. Und ich glaube, es ist
I believe no statesman has ever been as loved as Adolf Hitler was then.
Ja, das habe ich alles.
It's all come flooding back to me. Those were happy times.
Es waren glückliche Stunden.
To give work to the unemployed, Hitler launched huge public spending schemes. Two and a half thousand miles of Autobahn were announced, linking major cities.
Das neue deutsche Reichs-Autostraßennetz ist nicht nur in der Anlage das gewaltigste, was es diese Art auf der Welt gibt. Da können diese Menschen hergehen und im Ausland dann ihre dummen Zeitungsartikel herunterlesen, in denen sie zusammenschmieren, was sie an Lügen erfinden können. Am Ende, einmal kommt doch der und jener, der kommt nach Deutschland und da muss er sagen, Herrgott, was für einen Judenschwindel haben wir die ganze Zeit jetzt gelesen. Es ist ja ganz anders.
Ich habe dann auch als einer der ersten,
I was one of the first radio reporters to drive on the Autobahn. There were thousands and thousands of people watching with great excitement.
Tausende und Zehntausende von Menschen in einer jubelnden Begeisterung. Ich habe das natürlich auch klar und deutlich
Of course, I reported that it was a great achievement which we should be proud of and which would be repeated.
dass das eben auch so weitergehen wird, ja.
In the propaganda, the road builders were held up as an example of National Socialism in action.
Unsere Rundfunkfreunde hören lieber von eurem Schaffen. So? Dann sagen Sie ihnen aber, dass wir Brücken bauen, wie sie noch nie da waren. Ja. Und dass das, was wir bauen, auch hebt, waren wir noch 100 Jahre.
Like Goebbels had earlier, Gregor Strasser finally accepted all of Hitler's arguments for pragmatism, and in return they received promotions. Gregor was appointed as propaganda leader of the NSDAP, and Goebbels became Gauleiter, that would be the regional leader of Berlin. Eventually, things came to a head, and Otto refused to comply with Hitler's will, whereupon Hitler ordered Goebbels to expel him and the, quote, Salon Bolsheviks, as he called them. Claiming that he was the true National Socialist, Otto Strasser formed a splinter party called the Union of Revolutionary National Socialists, or the Black Front. Otto Strasser now attacked Hitler as, quote, the betrayer of the revolution. Otto, with 5,000 of his followers, officially left the NSDAP and published an article called The Socialists Leave the NSDAP, which lays down their grievances and problems with the direction the party was going in. It cited imperialism, vulgar anti-Semitism, and capitalist direction as reasons. While Otto was able to get a sizable number of people to follow him out of the party, unfortunately for him, he was not able to get any major leaders to leave the party with him. Not even his own brother Gregor supported him, and the two would not speak again until 1933. Otto Strasser was never able to gain much voting strength, and when Hitler gained power, he fled to Prague. In 1931, he was behind the SA mutiny in Berlin, where many SA men who were former communists were led by the Berlin SA chief, Captain Walter Stennes, who later in life became a Soviet spy. Stennes was advised and encouraged in the revolt by Otto Strasser. The authors James and Suzanne Poole reached the conclusion that, quote, "The evidence indicates that Stennes was financed by several important industrialists who were intent on destroying the Nazis," end quote. Otto Strasser himself admits in his book, Flight from Terror, that the foremost financial backers to Walter Stennes were Jewish multimillionaires, steel and coal industrialist Otto Wolff, and the Jewish banker Paul Silverberg. Money also came from the major German industrialist Hermann Bücher. They wished to keep Hitler out of power by any means necessary. Hitler, by personal intervention on the spot, quickly swung the great bulk of the SA men away from Stennes and Otto. In Otto's own words, the Jews and capitalist bourgeois class were proven to be the paymasters of the Otto Strasser-Walter Stennes plot in 1931. One of the accusations leveled against the NSDAP and Hitler by the Black Front was that they took bribes from German industrialists Krupp, Thyssen, etc., but today we know that the NSDAP never received anything but small amounts of money from capitalists, mostly from the nationalist-minded steel magnate Emil Kirdorf.
Aber diese ununterbrochene Entrückung lehnen wir ab. Und die Entbehrung ertragen wir nicht. Bei Diktaten wirken wir nicht mit. Wir mögen ein Diktat als Diktat oktroyieren. Es soll aber aus diesen Opfern heraus bei uns die Entschlossenheit kommen, der einst mit den Verantwortlichen an diesen Opfern ein unerbittliches Gericht zu halten.
The NSDAP instead financed their activities through membership fees, but also through entrance fees at meetings and by selling newspapers, writings, and books. The Black Front, on the other hand, received support from much more nefarious sources, from Jewish capital like Silverberg and Wolff. This was because their interests coincided in the desires of the Black Front, bourgeois class, and the Jews to crush the NSDAP. At the same time that Otto Strasser conducted a stubborn campaign against the Nazis, including gross smears against both Goebbels and Göring, they accepted his brother Gregor as a leading member of the party. The newspapers under Otto's control cautiously and cunningly criticized Hitler. For example, National Socialism is bigger than Hitler, etc. Goebbels wrote in his diary about Gregor, quote, "Strasser, unlike other leaders, was treated well by an otherwise hate-filled press," end quote. This, if anything, was serious evidence that something was severely wrong with Gregor Strasser too. Intense pressure was put on Gregor for his suspicion. So in 1932, Gregor wrote a letter to his brother who he hadn't spoken to after he left the Nazi party. Gregor said this to Otto, quote, "I am unable to meet you. You are highly dangerous for your friends and a tonic for your enemies. Your articles have harmed me enormously. Everything which I had brought up for discussion in respectable circles fell largely on deaf ears because you, quite wrongly, gave the impression that I was in touch undercover with you," end quote. Paul von Hindenburg wanted Kurt von Schleicher to become chancellor and invited Gregor to be his deputy. Schleicher, like Hindenburg, was hoping to use Gregor as a move to disrupt Hitler's party. Adolf Hitler challenged the move, claiming it was an attempt to create a split in the NSDAP. He also accused Gregor of being a traitor. In order to maintain party unity and to prove his innocence, Gregor resigned from all party positions and found work in a large chemical firm, with Hitler's approval on the condition that he stop all political activity. Gregor left politics completely during this time. Ernst Hanfstengel here explains the strategy being used against Hitler. Quote, "His plan was to split off the Strasser wing of the Nazi Party in a final effort to find a majority with the Weimar Socialists and Center. The idea was by no means so ill-conceived, and amidst the momentary demoralization and confusion in the Nazi ranks, very nearly came off." End quote. What Otto Strasser could do, Adolf Hitler could do 5 times better. Hitler was able to hold bigger rallies and win seats in government, along with being able to infiltrate the Black Front a lot better than the Black Front could infiltrate the NSDAP. They were able to break up meetings, discover plots against the NSDAP, and even jumped Otto at one point, albeit Otto pulled out a pistol, making them back off. It was not long until Hitler came to power in 1933, becoming Chancellor and then President of Germany in 1934. One of the first actions Hitler took was to ban the Black Front, and thus Otto Strasser went into hiding. But before doing so, Otto ordered that the remaining members of the Black Front were to infiltrate the NSDAP and prepare for the revolution which never came, and many of his followers were in fact later caught. They were immediately sent to concentration camps with communists and social democrats.
Deutsches Volk, besinne dich auf dich selbst, auf deine Vergangenheit, auf die Leistung deiner Väter, ja, auf die Leistung deiner eigenen Generation. Vergiss 14 Jahre Verfall und hebe dich empor zu 2000 Jahren deutscher Geschichte. Nur wenn ihr selbst im Vertrauen und in Zuversicht hinter uns tretet, kann das große Werk der Rettung unseres Volkes und euer Selbst gelingen.
The 30th of June to the 2nd of July 1934 was also known as the Night of the Long Knives. Hitler disempowered the SA's leadership and Gregor Strasser was killed. On the 30th of June 1934, he was taken to the Gestapo headquarters where he was shot in the back of the head. Gregor didn't die immediately and was instead left in his cell where he bled to death slowly. The purge of the SA was kept secret until it was announced by Hitler on July the 13th. It was during this speech that Hitler gave the purge its name, the Night of the Long Knives. Hitler claimed that 61 had been executed while 13 had been shot resisting arrest and 3 had committed suicide. Others have argued that as many as 400 people were killed during the purge. In his speech, Hitler explained why he had not relied on the courts to deal with the conspirators. Hitler called himself the supreme judge of the German people, so upon him fate moved as he ordered the ringleaders of the treason to be shot. The Night of the Long Knives attack took place in June of 1934 and many SA members were killed. Amongst the deaths were Ernst Röhm, an SA leader, and Gregor Strasser, a former Nazi official. Gregor's brother, Otto Strasser, subsequently went into exile. Alfred Rosenberg actually adds more context in his memoirs. Quote, "During the Rome Putsch, Strasser and Schleicher were killed. We all thought they had been involved in some way, but the police remained silent. The Führer made arrangements for the financial security of Strasser's widow, an extremely pleasant woman. In the Second World War, both of Strasser's sons fell as officers at the front. This is the sort of tragedy that is inevitable in the course of a revolution. Whenever I think of Strasser as he was in those days, I see before my eyes his tall figure and his light, kind eyes. I remember his generosity and, occasionally, also that apparent uncertainty which eventually led him to his doom. As the Führer told me later, he had intended to make Strasser his Secretary of the Interior. In that case, many things might have taken a different turn." End quote. Moreover, David Irving in The Warpath adds more context to what Rosenberg wrote, quote, "Much had in fact happened that unsettled Hitler. Goering wantonly liquidated Gregor Strasser, Hitler's rival, and there had been a rash of killings in Bavaria. Hitler's adjutant Brückner later described in private papers how Hitler vented his annoyance on Himmler when the Reichsführer SS appeared at the Chancellery with a final list of the victims, 82 all told. In later months, Viktor Lutze told anybody who would listen that the Führer had originally listed only 7 men. He had offered Röhm suicide, and when Röhm declined his offer, Hitler had him shot too. Hitler's 7 had become 17, the 17 then 82." End quote. According to Peter Stachura's biography of Gregor Strasser, he had meetings with Hitler sometime in late 1933 and early 1934 with discussions about him joining the new government. Alfred Rosenberg's memoirs, as I've shown, supports this. Himmler and Goering were the ones who drew up death lists. They were the ones who wanted Gregor dead. Gregor was slated to be either Minister of Economics, Minister of Labor, or Minister of the Interior, all of these being major roles within the party. This even destroys the myth that Gregor died because he was a socialist. He died because both Goering and Himmler viewed him as a threat to their own power in the party. After all, Gregor was the biggest critic of the two when he was still in the party. Another obscure but interesting fact regarding Gregor's death is that upon hearing it, Hitler reportedly, from Rosenberg, went into an extreme fit of rage. Moreover, if Gregor's death was not related to economics, then this is given further validation by the fact that Robert Ley, who was arguably the most left-wing person in the Nazi Party, lived and was in fact made leader of the German Labor Front, the Nazi government's national trade union. So why would Gregor die for being a socialist if another more radical socialist, Robert Ley, wasn't killed for the same reason? You can even extend this to figures like Joseph Goebbels or even Gottfried Feder. Otto Strasser went on to collaborate with communist and Jewish groups in his Black Front from 1930 to 1934, when they were trying to split the NSDAP. In early 1931, Otto Strasser's breakaway party, the Black Front, attempted to join the communist Antifa group, or Antifaschistische Aktion. Otto then cooperated with the British Secret Intelligence Service, the SIS, also known as MI6, which confirms that he was a true traitor. Sefton Delmer, the British expert in black propaganda during World War II, and the man behind the black radio station Gustav Siegfried I, mentions in his autobiography, Trails Sinister, that one of his role models was a secret black propaganda radio transmitter in Czechoslovakia operated by Otto Strasser, the radio engineer Rudolf Formis, who had been forced to flee Germany after having been uncovered as a saboteur. From this secret radio station, the most grotesque lies about Hitler and others were spread. It should be mentioned here that many of the hoaxes about sexual perversion among leading National Socialists stem from Otto Strasser. Otto's black radio transmitter was financed by Jews and was operated under the protection of the government in Czechoslovakia. Otto Strasser even told the OSS that Hitler had forced Gaily Raubal to urinate and defecate on him. This being a complete and total lie that's never been backed by evidence. The Jew Dr. Kurt Hiller, who got to know Otto Strasser during Strasser's long stay in Czechoslovakia, writes, quote, "Since 1930, first in Germany and then in exile, he, Strasser, waged an unfailing and brave fight against the werewolf, Hitler, in Germany." End quote. The Jew Fritz Max Kain writes in his book Men Against Hitler that he, in his role of leading the German resistance against Hitler, met regularly with Otto Strasser during the course of his fight against National Socialist Germany. Otto Strasser's contacts with the Jewish Interior Minister of France in the beginning of the war should also be mentioned in this context. As I've mentioned before, Otto wanted a confederatized Germany fragmented into small regional areas with autonomy, and big industry was perceived as a threat to that. Otto wanted to destroy the Prussian-dominated culture because it had a direct monopoly on power, as the state was extremely hierarchical in structure. This being of the biggest problems to Hitler due to him wanting to dissolve all regional differences to create a more centralized German state. In fact, in 1930, Otto Strasser cited the NSDAP's inconsistent stance on federalism as one of the major reasons for leaving the party, meaning one of the major disagreements with Otto, besides the Jewish question, economics, and race realism, was on the issue of federalism.
An entire country falls into step, freely or under coercion. Hitler seeks the total dictatorship. This requires domination over the whole of society. In other words, the elimination or equalization of all social associations and groups. Starting in 1933, all segments of the state, society, and economy are gradually brought into line. The biggest obstacle for Hitler is the sovereignty of the regional states. This is repealed bit by bit, and in 1934, finally transferred to the Reich by law. Reichsstatthalter assume the leadership roles of the individual states. Groß Reinemachen. The civil service is made to reflect the new state. By law, Jewish or politically unpopular civil servants are removed from state service. The trade unions, organizations consisting of millions of workers and employees, represent a particularly serious threat in the eyes of the National Socialists. On May 2, 1933, they are disbanded throughout Germany. SA troops lay waste to trade union halls. They arrest functionaries and burn records. In place of the trade unions comes the National Socialist Deutsche Arbeitsfront. The National Socialist press cheers the complete integration of all workers. General cleaning. The trade unions are disbanded. Now come the political parties. The Berlin-based SPD party headquarters are occupied by the SA. The other parties disband themselves. In mid-July, the NSDAP is declared the only legitimate party. The Reichstag, with only NSDAP members, meets rarely and serves as a stage for Hitler's proclamations. An opposition no longer exists.
Even more interesting is that the periodical of World Jewry on the 28th of August 1936 carried the following report from its Prague correspondent, quote, "The well-known rival of Herr Hitler, Otto Strasser, has published an appeal to the German Jewish emigrants to join the newly formed Organization of German Jews headed by Herr Rosheim. In his opinion, the solution to the problem of the Jews in Germany lies in the direction of assimilation." End quote. Part of Hitler's socialism was also his fanatical belief in anti-Semitism, as the historian Henry Ashby Turner has pointed out. Otto Strasser was heavily critical of the Jewish question, just like biological racism. Otto proposed that Jews choose to individually do these two things: become a national minority within their own autonomous area, aka regional segregation. This applied to other races as well. Or fully assimilate into Germany, renouncing their religion in the process, therefore becoming Christian instead. This is of course a huge deviation from Hitler's views, who instead wanted them deported from Germany. Otto Strasser tended to look at Jews like any other race. If they have consistent cultural interaction, this leads to problems. In other words, get rid of the culture and you'll end the internal conflict. Hitlerism, on the other hand, holds that as long as you have multiracialism, you'll have chaos in society, because to Hitlerism, culture is connected to race and is therefore the same thing. In fact, in 1928, Otto Strasser said this regarding the Jews, quote, "Anti-Semitism is dead. Long live the idea of the people." End quote. In 1938, Otto Strasser moved to Switzerland and afterwards to France. The British ambassador in Berlin, in a letter to the British Foreign Secretary on the 18th of July 1939, said, quote, "So many people such as Otto Strasser and others of this world are seeking with intense pertinacity to drive us to war with Germany." End quote. According to W.J. West in The Truth Betrayed, at the time of the Burgerbrau Keller bomb plot in November of 1939, which failed to kill Hitler as intended, and which the German authorities held to have been masterminded by the British Secret Services working through Otto Strasser, There were, in fact, very strong links between Strasser and the British authorities through Sir Robert Vansittart, the quote, permanent head of the Foreign Office and later chief diplomatic advisor to the government, who in October of 1939 recommended to the Foreign Secretary Otto Strasser and Hermann Rauschning, another defector responsible for a volume of lies entitled Hitler Speaks, exposed by Swiss historian Wolfgang Hennel. After the failure of the bomb plot, it is significant that Vansittart turned against Otto, clearly implying that his reputation was bound up with it. Material from Otto Strasser went to make up the book Der Führer, which was issued in the name of Konrad Haydn, which, along with Rauschning, was used in formulating the indictment of the International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg, whereby leading Germans were put to death. Otto Strasser's material was also used by Dr. William C. Langer in his book The Mind of Adolf Hitler, a piece of wartime propaganda he was assigned to concoct by the American Dirty Tricks Department known as the OSS, now the CIA. Otto Strasser also fled to Austria, then to Czechoslovakia, Switzerland, France, and finally to Canada. During this time, outside of Germany, Otto gave lectures and speeches against the regime, along with trying to organize whatever was left of his Black Front organization. Otto also tried to attack the regime head-on by attacking the NSDAP HQ in Nuremberg, but the plot was discovered, and the attacker Helmut Hirsch, a German Jew, was executed. Nazi agents also tried to capture Otto several times, but he always escaped. He even collaborated with both the Austrian and Czechoslovakian government, but he would later be told to leave due to the NSDAP's pressures and imminent invasion by Germany. Otto would go on to live in Canada, collaborating with the British government, writing for the New Statesman, and wrote his biography Hitler and I and his book Germany Tomorrow. Otto even tried to get these two books inside Germany to incite a revolution against Hitler. However, Canada would soon forbid him from publishing political writings in 1943 due to his ideology and past associations with the Nazi Party, which led Otto to be very bitter. Conclusions. After explaining the sharp historical distinction between Hitler and Otto, I feel that I should lay out what characteristics I believe to be the key to the different ideological strains. Firstly, I will start with Hitlerism. The Führerprinzip. Basically, the political will to the nation is embodied in the Führer, a type of political absolutism rendering most forms of democracy abolished. Pan-Germanism. The notion that all people of Germanic descent should be unified within one greater German Reich. Empire. Hitler believed that Germany lacked the essential resources required for the Reich's survival and devised a mercantilist theory in which Germany would have autarky as well as regain lost German land by peaceful or forceful means. Eugenics. In accordance with Hitler's racialist beliefs, the Third Reich implemented eugenic laws for the enhancement of the race. The NSDAP also passed legislation outlawing miscegenation with non-citizens. This includes the anti-Jewish laws such as the Nuremberg laws, as well as agrarianism and environmentalist views that were tied to racialism and promoted minor land redistribution. Corporatist dirigism. Adolf Hitler preserved private ownership over some enterprises under strict conditions that the state regulated these businesses to run in accordance with the nation's collective interests. Such regulations included price controls, wage controls, job security, investment controls, dividend restrictions, production quotas, and a state trade union. Companies which didn't comply with state ordinances were nationalized or given to people who would comply. Social welfare. Hitler's regime also implemented several social welfare measures. A new socialized healthcare program was started, expanding coverage to all German citizens. Public work projects were created to combat unemployment, social security was expanded, low-cost homes were constructed for the great German proletariat, generous loans, tax breaks, and welfare services were given to German families. The Kraft durch Freude, or Strength Through Joy state initiative, gave paid vacations to all German workers, as well as free cultural events to attend, etc. Federalism. Hitler believed in increasing the Prussian domination of culture and in gradually fading out its autonomy as to forge a more united German identity. Now let's have a look at the characteristics of Otto Strasser's socialism. International nationalism. Otto argued this would entail an economic cooperation between all socialistic partners, so as to avoid the counterproductive aspects of economic competition between states and help create a coalition against capitalism. Historically, this means allying with the Soviet bloc and helping Third Worldist liberation movements. Anti-imperialism. Otto believed in the right to self-determination for all races, cultures, and states. Confederacy. Otto promoted the decentralization of Germany, turning the nation into several distinct regions which would be self-governing autonomous communities, though all regions would practice the same guild socialist economic model and German culture. This included a grand council that placed checks and balances onto the executive. Guild socialization. Otto promoted the outright collectivization of the means of production. Similar to Hitler's corporatism, guilds were to govern their workplaces and regions, with state oversight to ensure such businesses were acting in accordance with nationalist interests. The bourgeoisie class was to be abolished in the new socialist mode of production. Finance capital was also to be nationalized by the state. Land reform. Otto promoted extreme land expropriation of the large landed estates of the aristocracy, middle class, industrialists, and military in Germany, with the land to be redistributed to the people. All land would be owned by the state, but family farmers would be granted hereditary title to the plots of land. The farms would remain in the possession of each family until such a time as the family no longer had a descendant willing to farm the land. Anti-racism and anti-anti-Semitism. Otto believed race, like the Jewish problem, to be a purely cultural phenomena that could easily be dealt with by assimilation or regional autonomy. When the Strasserists did engage in anti-Semitism, it was only from a class perspective. After explaining what makes them different, in my own personal views, I think that if Otto Strasser had his way, National Socialism would never have taken power, for he would have disrupted its appeal, frightening off essential support. No sensible person will really credit him with the ability to succeed, as Hitler did, in winning and holding the hearts of a nation. Otto always aggravated Nazi leadership and therefore was always a subversive. National Socialism, properly understood, has never been a mere combination of socialism with nationalism. This is where Strasserism falls short completely. It is derived from the conception of the national folk community as a strong belief that this racial kinship justifies and decrees radical social justice, and thus the belief is strengthened by the leadership principle. Again, derived from its racial belief that private property must be subject to national regulation and supervision to ensure that its productive efficacy is fairly distributed and in accordance with national requirements, but it has never accepted the idea that nationalization of property is the only and necessary means to adequate social justice, any more than it has been prepared to tolerate the anarchic iniquity of liberal capitalism as the only answer. I'd even go as far as to argue that Hitler viewed private property as a privilege, as did many others in the party. The argument that Hitler dogmatically defended private property or that Hitler was a capitalist is a false distinction promoted by the uneducated or subversives spreading false information. Hitler always stood for reconciliation under a strong state, not conflict of private and public interests. Even according to the Jewish Marxist economist Richard Wolff, Hitler, by his own interpretation, still followed one strain of socialism, as did Otto. Moreover, these various quotes from The Vampire Economy by the communist economist Günther Reimann show the reality for business under the Nazis. Günther preserved these letters from businessmen, and this is what they say. Quote, "I must confess that I think as most German businessmen do, who today fear National Socialism as much as they did communism in 1932. But there is a distinction. In 1932, the fear of communism was a phantom. Today, National Socialism is a terrible reality. Business friends of mine are convinced that it will be the turn of the white Jews, which means us, Aryan businessmen. After the Jews have been expropriated, the difference between this and the Russian system is much less than you think, despite the fact that we are still independent businessmen." End quote. Quote, "You have no idea how far state control goes and how much power the Nazi representatives have over our work. In this aspect, they certainly differ from the former social democratic officials. These Nazi radicals think of nothing except distributing the wealth. Some businessmen have even started studying Marxist theories so that they will have a better understanding of the present economic system." End quote. Quote, "You cannot imagine how taxation has increased, yet everyone is afraid to complain about it. The new state loans are nothing but confiscation of private property, because no one believes that the government will ever make repayment, not even pay interest after the first few years." End quote. Quote, "The old type of capitalist who adheres to the traditional concepts of property rights is doomed to failure under fascism." End quote. After World War II, Otto Strasser was invited to join the DDR, the East German Communist government, but he refused. Other former Nazis like Bruno Ficke and Otto Ernst Riemer were enthusiastic about the DDR, who saw in working with the Soviet Union the possibility of reinventing and reviving National Socialism. Otto didn't join the DDR, however, as they were integrating Hitlerists into the government. This was something he personally found to be completely repugnant. Once Otto got back to West Germany, he created his own party called the German Social Union, but it did not go anywhere and fell apart in 1962. Otto also took part in the European Social Movement and the National European Party, parties that advocated for a unified European state which included various nationalist and fascist parties such as Oswald Mosley's Union Movement, Jean Europe, the Italian Social Movement, and the Socialist Reich Party. Otto would constantly debate other members such as Oswald Mosley on foreign policy, with Otto taking a more pro-Soviet stance, and argued with some that the Holocaust happened. Otto would also have contact with Jean-François Saint-Tirard, a man with similar ideas to Otto who would later go on to influence Alexander Dugin. Otto also had contact with a London-based Jockeyite group. Otto Strasser, throughout the remainder of his life, would try defending his ideas and actions along with distancing himself from Hitler's National Socialism. It would not be until after his death that some nationalist circles would take on some of his ideas, such as the Other Russia. Otto Strasser died of natural causes in March of 1974, outliving most of the NSDAP leadership and his rivals, but hardly as influential as the others. This is more of a small historical caveat, but I do feel it's necessary to mention. Some wrongly call Strasserism a form of National Bolshevism. Though Otto did have connections with Karl Otto Patel, the leader of the German National Bolshevik Party via Ernst Jünger, Patel was not particularly fond of Otto ideologically. Both of them didn't like Hitler or fascism, but Otto was also still disliked by Patel. Patel believed Otto was promoting a form of feudal socialism and was therefore an anti-scientific fool. Patel even argued that, quote, "all the problems Strasser has with Marx would be solved by reading Marx," end quote, in the National Bolshevik Manifesto of 1933. Moreover, Patel was a pagan supremacist and called Hitler a political Catholic. He also called Otto Strasser a Jew worshipper. Patel went on to say the following, quote, "They must free themselves from the shackles of Christianity, which stunts their heroism and makes them susceptible to enslavement by Rome," end quote. Otto also tried to collaborate with some inside the conservative revolution like Ernst Jünger, Kurt Hiller, and the National Bolshevik thinker Karl Otto Patel and Ernst Niekesch against Hitler, but this largely failed. Otto Strasser did not believe in dialectical materialism or internationalism, which are core components of Marxism. Patel found this extremely distasteful. While Otto Strasser did associate with Karl Otto Patel for a time, Patel would criticize him for wanting a German confederation, and instead Patel argued that Hitler was more correct for wanting a strong German federalist state. Patel also disliked Otto's extreme agrarianism, as it would destroy almost all German industry. Patel, who followed Marxist economic ideas, found this to be extremely deadly for Germany and instead supported more industrialization. Many today tend to think that Strasserism was the only variation of left-wing socialistic ideas in the Nazi Party, but this is not true, as more radical socialists in the NSDAP like Rudolf Jung, Robert Ley, Gottfried Feder, and Joseph Goebbels remained loyal to Hitler and influenced Nazi government policy strongly. The Strasserists of today, in my opinion, wrongly accused Hitler of becoming a tool of big business, and betraying his cause and his followers. The crucial point in this connection is not whether Hitler accepted vitally needed money from big business or any other quarter, but whether, in doing so, he allowed any money from any source to prevent him from the cause he believed in and stood for. And the answer to this, from any sensible survey, must be an emphatic no. Furthermore, historical facts do not support this. Hitler, whatever the hopes of his contributors were, was never up for purchase, and always remained the master. Besides that, as I've shown, Otto Strasser received money from the bourgeois class and even collaborated with other foreign governments against Hitler, tried to have Hitler killed, collaborated with Jews and communists, denied race and anti-Semitism, was a witness at the Nuremberg trials resulting in the deaths of Nazi officials, and finally, was actively spreading disinformation about Hitler both during the war and after the war. Hitler, from what I understand, was going to push Germany into a new republican state with both a state and parliament gradually after the war. This included a council to elect the next executive who would have unlimited power like himself. This can be found in both the book Hitler's Table Talks and Hitler a Confidant for those interested in the topic. Roger Griffin's account in The Nature of Fascism asserted that both brothers were divided on the question of loyalty to the NSDAP. Quote, Gregor Strasser remained faithful to Nazism while his brother Otto was its bitter critic, end quote. From this in-depth analysis, we can correctly see that Gregor Strasser was a martyr of National Socialism and was loyal to Hitler, meaning it's fundamentally immoral in my view for Hitlerists to celebrate his death. Otto Strasser, on the other hand, was a true traitor. The only reason why Otto Strasser's socialism is considered a form of National Socialism is because of some shared origins along with advocating for a form of nationalism and socialism. But in reality, beyond these superficial similarities, they were completely different things. Gregor being on Otto's side the entire time is largely built on a legend, a myth, one that Otto seems to have originally been responsible for, and that gullible people have kept propagating ever since. The idea that there was this united wing of leftist good guys within the NSDAP who could have prevented all the nastiness if they'd won out, it's really a lot like Trotskyism in this case. Otto was so focused on his own legend that he was thoughtless about how it would affect others. Even decades after the war, he was still writing about Gregor as if they were in total ideological agreement, but in reality they weren't. Otto even went as far as to begging Gregor's widow to let him use his brother's ashes for propaganda. She declined and asked him not to use Gregor's death for political ends, yet he still used his brother's death to his advantage politically anyway. The more you read, the more you realize how disingenuous Otto really was. His books are full of distortions and self-serving lies designed to build up his own image and to paint him and his brother, Gregor, as arm-in-arm fighters against Hitlerism. In reality, Gregor's perspective on Hitler was far more complex, and Gregor's own ideas, especially by 1930, were on the more moderate and even conservative end of the National Socialist spectrum. The myth of the Strasser brothers as some collective entity with a united Strasser wing is completely false. In Peter Stachura's book, Gregor Strasser and the Rise of Nazism, Stachura accurately characterizes Otto as an opportunist and a troublemaker, whose ideology was never really that deep or thought out. In contrast, he characterizes Gregor as a much more stable man and a true workhorse for the Nazi Party, but whose ideology wasn't particularly leftist and who in fact became much more open to alliances with the conservatives like Hitler by the end of his political career. Stachura seems to also believe, like myself, that there was no real identifiable Strasser bloc within Nazism, and that Otto basically lied about Gregor supporting him post-expulsion. His support was minimal, and he's only known because he made a lot of noise besides having a famous brother. Maybe if Otto had restrained himself from lying about Gregor, his brother would have managed to make it out alive. Unfortunately, this is all speculation on my end. The sad reality now is that one good man, Gregor Strasser, is forever tainted by the actions of his fool of a brother Otto, and is now relegated to being an insult by uneducated Hitlerites, or is wrapped into a false idol by Otto acolytes. I'll now end this with a final quote. Quote, "One more word about our relationship with Marxist socialism. We are not only separated from Jewish-born and Jewish-led Marxism by our fervent national attitude, but we are different from it by something even deeper: rejection of the materialist worldview. We, for whom personality is everything, we hate the homogenizing mass delusion of Marxist ideology from the depths of our soul. Socialism is not the rule of the masses, the leveling of performance and wages. Rather, socialism is instead that deeply Prussian, German service to the whole, out of recognition that each individual is a part, a deeply connected part of this whole. The hate-filled envy of legitimately acquired property is as alien to we National Socialists as is hollow contrarianism against leadership. But this property must not consist of plundered national assets, and this leadership must not consist of profit-driven rule over the economic life and the death of the workers." End quote.
So I want to devote this program to going over with you the three major ways this idea of socialism is understood, because those ways are relevant today. Those ways are fighting it out amongst themselves in terms of the allegiance and feelings and thoughts of people around the world. And they're going to shape our future. So here's the first one. In this view, socialism has to do with the government. That's right. The government is to come in and regulate, control a private capitalist economy. That's right. An economy governed by private enterprises owned by private citizens who trade with one another in an institution called the market, where they buy and sell their labor, their work, their products, their services. That's right, it's a capitalist economy, private enterprise, markets, but one in which the government is brought in. Some people mean socialism by that. And they mean particularly that the government is brought in a certain way. Number one, the government is to regulate what the private enterprises do so that they are less self-serving, profit-oriented, and are more socially concerned. That's why minimum wage is something socialists always supported. Many of them want there to be limits on how much prices can be raised by corporations or how much profits can be earned by them. And the second reason socialists want the government to come in is to redistribute wealth, because capitalism has this tendency to concentrate wealth in very few hands and deprive the mass of people. So the socialists want the government to come in using taxes and using government spending to do a bit of redistribution, to equalize a system that turns unequal very quickly. So for these people, socialism means that the government comes in, regulates and taxes to make what we might call capitalism, because it leaves business in the hands of private enterprises and markets, but we could call it capitalism with a humane face, capitalism with a certain welfare focus, the welfare of all the people. And here are some examples. Denmark, Norway, Germany, Italy, France. Those countries are often referred to as socialist. Their governments are often governments of socialist parties, and that's what those parties mean, that they will have the government do this regulating and redistributing. That's one concept of socialism around the world. It's pretty close to what Bernie Sanders means in the United States, or what Jeremy Corbyn means in Great Britain. But here's the second one. In the second view, this first one doesn't go far enough. Because yes, the government comes in and controls things and redistributes, but it's in a perpetual war which the government often loses with those very private enterprises who try to get around the government regulation, who try to get around the government taxation. We're all familiar with those examples of companies, for example, Amazon, which has earned billions in profits the last 2 years and paid absolutely no taxes to the United States government. Indeed, this last year, they're getting a refund in excess of $100 million. So we know that private corporations do everything in their power to use their profits, to use their political power, to undo, to evade all of those socialistic regulations and redistributions. And this has led some socialists to say you have to go further. It isn't enough to regulate and redistribute. The government should, here we go, directly take over the enterprises. There shouldn't be private enterprises because those will always be run for the profit of the private owner. If you want the economy to serve everybody, then the agent of everybody, the government that we all elect, at least in theory, should take over and run the businesses so they behave in the way that's good for everybody, and there isn't this perpetual war between a regulating government and private enterprise. And the same argument says we shouldn't allow the market to decide who gets what, because a market always delivers whatever is scarce to the people with the most money. It's an institution for those who are rich and who stay that way by using the market. So these socialists go further. The government should take over enterprises, literally own and operate the factories, stores, and offices, and instead of the market deciding who gets what, it should be planned in terms of what we want for the society as a whole. These kinds of socialists, after the 1920s, took the name communists to signal that they went further than the other socialists in order to take over, through the government, the apparatus of the economy. So some people mean by socialism government regulating a private capitalism to make it more humane, to make it less unequal. And other people say, no, socialism means, for them, that the government takes over the enterprise and plans the distribution of output rather than leaving it to the market. And this second group of socialists often, not always, but often takes the name communist to show how they're different from the first group. And in those kinds of examples, the Soviet Union, the People's Republic of China, and for parts of their history, Cuba, Vietnam, and so on, are examples. Now let's get to the third kind of socialism that's contesting in the world today. To become the important kind, to become the kind believed in and followed by most people, to win your interest as well. And this approach is in a way an evolution out of the other two. It's a kind of critical evolution because it is advanced by people who see some merits in the first kind of socialism, government regulation, the second kind, government operating enterprises, but say we don't think that's enough in one way and it's too much in the other. Here's how it's not enough. It's not enough because it doesn't change the workplace, the place where the mass of people do their economic thing, using their brains and muscles to transform objects into the goods and services we all need to live the lives we want to live. It doesn't change it enough. Meanwhile, it does something too much. It gives too much power to the government. As a government that has this much power to regulate and redistribute, let alone a government that takes over owning and operating, is a government that runs us the risk that it'll do a lot more than these economic things, using its power for political or cultural controls of a society that we have seen and we don't want again. Well, then these kinds of socialists have a new focus. For them, what will really make a difference, what will take us beyond capitalism and be a better way of organizing society focuses on the enterprise, the workplace. And it goes like this. We have the economic system we have, with its good points and its bad points, in large part because we don't allow democracy into the workplace. And these socialists say, capitalism never did that. Capitalism is a hierarchical way of organizing an enterprise. A few people, the owner, the shareholders who have the big blocks of shares, they run capitalist enterprises. The mass of us have no control at all, and they run it for them. And the way to change society to make it better is to have the people who work in an enterprise, all of them, one person, one vote, have democratic control of the workplace as just as important as having democratic control of the community in which you live, the neighborhood in which you exist, and so on. This kind of socialism is micro-focused. It says, let's not talk only about the government and private enterprise. We don't mind private enterprise. The government doesn't have to control everything. There has to be some coordination, but the big issue for us, say these socialists, is the transformation of the workplace, the socialization of the workplace, so it becomes a community run democratically rather than something run by a small number of people who put their benefits, the so-called bottom line, as profits for them rather than a good life for everybody. Okay, those kinds of socialism are arguing with one another for your attention and your allegiance. To be interested in socialism doesn't mean you're necessarily the believer of one or the other. Most real socialist societies have mingled the control function of government with the ownership function of government. What most experiments have not done is really tried that other kind of socialism that revolutionizes the workplace, brings democracy to the workplace for the first time, and says that's the way to get beyond the limits of capitalism, its inequalities, its instabilities, its injustices. So the question that's being fought out is not the question capitalism versus socialism, or at least it's not only that. It's also a struggle going on among these different definitions and meanings of socialism that are just as important to what's going on as the so-called struggle between capitalism and socialism that was so crucial in the last 100 years.
Siamo in campo contro le democrazie plutocratiche e reazionarie dell'Occidente